After the base foundation is laid to any system, the derivative characteristics can then be identified. In terms of warfare, these are the outputs that the 7 base foundation produces when it is weaponized by the enemy. 1. Constants. Every warfare system, no matter how sophisticated it appears, is built from fundamental principles that already existed in nature, in the universe, in the self, and in God. These principles are neutral, neither good nor bad in themselves. Melanin is a constant. Frequency is a constant. The Hermetic laws are constants. Consciousness is a constant. The enemy did not create these things. He studied them, imitated them, and built weapons from them. And because constants cannot be created or destroyed, any system built in opposition to them is ultimately temporary. The constant will outlast the system every time. 2. Interchangeables. These are the components of the system that can be swapped out without disrupting the overall function. Politicians are interchangeable. Media platforms are interchangeable. Cultural trends are interchangeable. This is why so much energy directed at surface-level targets produces frustration. You remove one, and another appears in its place because the foundational constants driving the system were never addressed. The operator deliberately keeps the target's attention fixed on interchangeable components so that the constants underneath remain untouched, and the system continues running regardless of which faces or forms are currently occupying the surface. 3. Demarcations of logic and evidence. Every system establishes a boundary. It is the circumference of activity that prescribes what is considered possible, credible, and discussable within that system's contextual laws. Inside the demarcation is coded as true, rational, and acceptable. Outside, the demarcation is coded as false, crazy, and dangerous. This boundary is not drawn by nature or by logic. It is drawn by the mind that built the system, and it is enforced not primarily through violence, but through social consequence, ridicule, and marginalization. The most important understanding here is that the truths most threatening to the system have been deliberately placed outside the demarcation, which means the intensity of the ridicule directed at any given idea is itself directional evidence pointing toward what the system most needs you to dismiss. 4. Superficial complexity. As discussed, the system produces the appearance of overwhelming, unconquerable complexity by multiplying its matrices, stacking institutions, laws, cultural mechanisms, technical systems, and bureaucratic layers on top of each other until the whole structure appears to require a lifetime of specialized expertise to navigate. This is the trick. The complexity is superficial. It is a deliberate multiplication of surface detail designed to exhaust the analytical mind before it can reach the simple base logic underneath. But the base logic is always simple. 7 foundational principles operating in distorted form, producing every derivative output in the entire system. Basic, step-by-step arithmetic and common sense is all that is needed to decode it. The complexity is not evidence of depth, it is evidence of concealment. 5. Adaptive. The system adjusts and evolves in response to pressure. When a population begins to decode one mechanism of control, the system shifts its visible form. The medium changes, the language changes, the surface changes, the base code does not. This is why attacking the surface produces temporary results at best. 6. Dynamic. The system is never static. It is continuously changing, continuously incorporating new influences, continuously updating its approach. It is not a fixed target. It is a living architecture that moves with the environment. 7. Multifaceted. The system operates on multiple dimensions simultaneously: economic, psychological, cultural, biological, spiritual, all layers active at the same time. This is part of what produces the illusion of complexity. The target addresses one dimension while the others continue operating undisturbed. 8. Regenerative. The system can renew and restore itself. Individual victories against specific components do not produce systemic collapse because the system rebuilds around the removal. The regenerative capacity is sustained by the foundational constants the system is drawing from, and it will continue regenerating until those foundational inputs are addressed. 9. Transfigurative. The system changes its form while retaining its fundamental character. Slavery transfigures into mass incarceration. Overt propaganda transfigures into algorithmic content curation. Colonial extraction transfigures into international debt structures. The name changes, The mechanism changes. The base logic and the intended output do not. 10. Atrophic. Certain components of the system decline and degenerate over time, either from lack of use, internal contradiction, or external pressure. Atrophy in a system is a signal. It marks where the system is weakest, where the base logic is being most successfully countered, and where concentrated pressure can produce collapse. 11. Interchangeable. Components can be swapped without affecting overall function. This mirrors the principle described above. The system is modular by design so that the removal of any single component does not threaten the whole. Understanding this prevents the trap of celebrating the removal of a surface component as a systemic victory. 12. Output determines input. The results the system produces loop back and shape the conditions for future inputs. This is the self-sustaining mechanism. A population conditioned into poverty produces the economic conditions that justify continued economic exploitation. A population conditioned into violence produces the social conditions that justify continued surveillance and policing. The output becomes the justification for the input that produced it. The cycle feeds itself. 13. Repetition of frequency waves. The system operates through recurring patterns and cycles. The same narratives repeat. The same crises are manufactured on schedule. The same psychological loops are reinforced continuously through media, education, and cultural repetition. Repetition is not accidental. It is the primary mechanism of installation because a thing repeated enough times bypasses critical analysis and becomes accepted as self-evident truth. 14. Demarcation. The system establishes and enforces its own boundaries, defining what interactions are permissible, what information is credible, and what conclusions are reachable within its framework. The demarcation is the fence that keeps the target's thinking inside the territory the system controls. 15. Feedback loops. Outputs route back as inputs, continuously reinforcing the system's own dynamics. Positive feedback loops amplify. A small initial condition is magnified into a dominant pattern. Negative feedback loops diminish. Resistance is absorbed and neutralized before it can compound into a threat. The system uses both. It amplifies what serves it and diminishes what threatens it, and it does this automatically without requiring conscious direction at every point because the loops are architectural. 16. Concreteness. The system has tangible, physical, measurable attributes that make it analyzable. This is the key that is most often overlooked. The system is not purely abstract. It expresses itself in concrete, observable, documentable forms such as in legislation, in institutions, in media content, in economic data, in biological outcomes. And because it is concrete, it can be studied, documented, mapped, and decoded. The evidence is always present. The question is whether the observer has been given the framework to recognize what they are looking at. Now, before we elaborate on these systemic concepts, let us first establish the unified case. Because someone might ask, why does all of this matter together? Why is it not enough to understand just one piece? Why does liberation require understanding melanin science and hermetic law, and binary code and hypnotic induction and MK Ultra, and occult symbolism and the psychology of the enemy all at once? The answer is this. The system operates on all of these levels simultaneously, and a defense that only addresses one level leaves every other level open. If you understand the biology of melanin, but not the mechanics of hypnotic induction, you know what you carry, but you do not know how the enemy is continuously working to suppress your access to it through frequency manipulation and psychological programming. If you understand MKUltra but not the Hermetic laws, you can identify the trauma-based techniques, but you cannot see how those techniques are derivatives of a foundational architecture that replicates itself across every institution and cultural mechanism in the system. If you understand the binary code of language but not the psychology and motive of the enemy, you can see that false data has been installed, but you cannot predict where the next installation is coming from or read the coded language being used to deliver it. If you understand the superficial complexity, but not the constants and interchangeables, you can see through the overwhelming surface detail, but you will still waste energy targeting components that will simply be replaced. If you understand the demarcation, but not the feedback loop, you can identify where the fence is, but you will not understand how the fence is being maintained inside your own mind, Through the outputs your own conditioned thinking continues to produce. Every piece of knowledge in this series is a specific tool addressing a specific mechanism of the system. Remove any tool and a gap opens. The system is multi-layered by design, precisely to ensure that partial understanding produces partial defense, which is not sufficient. Total understanding is not overwhelming. Remember, the complexity is superficial. Total understanding is actually the simplification of what appears complex, because once you have the 7-base hermetic foundation, once you understand the OS, the binary, the frequency mechanisms, the derivative characteristics, the constants and interchangeables, the entire system becomes readable, not because it stopped being sophisticated, but because you now have a framework that reduces every surface manifestation back to its foundational logic. Again, the enemy's secret language becomes transparent when you know his psychology. His adaptive surface changes become predictable when you are watching the constants underneath, rather than the interchangeable forms on top. His suppression tells you what to study. His ridicule tells you where the truth is. His complexity tells you he is hiding something simple. And his borrowed power tells you that the original constant that he imitated still exists, intact, in you. Understanding the derivative characteristics of the system is what allows you to read the system in real time and to see it moving, adapting, and regenerating in the world around you, and to respond strategically rather than reactively. Now that we have established the unified case, let us now elaborate on each. We will start with the aspect of systemic constants, because this is the most important concept in the entire framework, and it is the one that most people often skip over. Every warfare system ever built, every system of oppression, control, psychological manipulation, and spiritual suppression was built from materials that already existed. The enemy did not create the tools he uses against you. He studied what already existed in nature, in the universe, in the self, and in God. Then he weaponized it. Frequency already existed. Melanin already existed. The principles of rhythm, vibration, cause and effect, and polarity already existed. Consciousness already existed. Language already existed. The Hermetic laws were not invented by the occultist. They were observed and then encoded into doctrine. This is what constants are. The fundamental, neutral principles of self, nature, universe, and God that cannot be created and cannot be destroyed. They are neither good nor bad in themselves. Fire is neutral. Frequency is neutral. The law of causality is neutral. Binary logic is neutral. They become tools of liberation or tools of oppression, depending entirely on who is applying them and toward what end. And here is why this matters for dismantling the system. The enemy's power is borrowed power. It is not original. It is not inherent. Every capability he has demonstrated, such as every technology, every mind control technique, every occult practice, every system of governance and economic extraction, is downstream from a constant that he did not originate. He imitated melanin with technology. He imitated natural kundalini awakening with electroshock and trauma. He imitated the wisdom of ancient melanated civilizations in his architecture, his occult doctrine, and his science, and then erased the citation. The system is built on borrowed constants from Black Aboriginal nature and science, which means the system is fundamentally dependent on continued access to what it borrowed, and the people from whom those constants were borrowed, which are the people who carry those constants internally, biologically and spiritually, are the only ones with genuine, non-manufactured access to the source. Thus, a system built on imitation cannot outlast the original. A constant cannot be destroyed. The system that borrowed from the constant is temporary by definition. Understanding this is not arrogance. It is structural analysis. The constant will always outlast the system built around imitating it. Always. Constants also have their opposites, which are interchangeables. And understanding the difference between the two is what separates strategic thinking from reactive thinking. Interchangeables are the components of the system that can be replaced without disrupting the overall function. They are modular by design, and the system is built this way deliberately because a modular system is resilient. You can remove a component and the system roots around it, regenerates the function, and continues operating. Politicians are interchangeable. One administration replaces another, and the foundational policies of empire continue. Media platforms are interchangeable. One gets regulated or loses credibility, and three more appear performing the same function. Cultural figureheads are interchangeable. Individual laws are interchangeable. Corporate structures are interchangeable. The faces change, the logos change, the stated values change, but the base function does not change. This is why so much political and social energy directed at surface-level targets produces exhaustion without liberation. The target is real. The problem is real. But the component being targeted is interchangeable, which means its removal does not threaten the system. It only triggers the system's regenerative function, which replaces the component and continues. The enemy, who is the operator, understands this all too well. This is why so much effort goes into directing the population's attention toward interchangeable components. Keep the focus on the politician, the platform, the trend, and the individual institution, and the constants and foundational architecture that actually drive the system remain untouched and invisible. Strategic dismantling requires targeting constants, which are the foundational principles that the system is running on, not the interchangeables, and the primary constant the system depends on is the subjugated target's own mental operating system running the enemy's code, which brings us back, always, to the mind. Then we have demarcation, in which every system is established. It is a circumference of activity, a boundary that prescribes what is considered possible, what is considered credible, and what is considered discussable within that system's contextual laws. Inside the demarcation is coded as rational, acceptable, and true. Outside the demarcation is coded as irrational, dangerous, and false. And this boundary is not drawn by nature or by logic. It is drawn by the mind that built the system and enforces it through social consequences such as ridicule, marginalization, professional destruction, or pathologization, then installed into the target population through the same hypnotic mechanisms we described earlier: repetition, frequency, entrainment, binary assignment. The demarcation is the fence around your thinking, and the most important thing to understand about it is this: the truths most threatening to the system have been placed deliberately outside the fence. The history of melanin science, the documented properties of neuromelanin, the real history of ancient civilizations, the mechanisms of MK Ultra applied at a social scale, the connection between occult doctrine and the suppression of biological knowledge, the psychology of the enemy's motive. All of it has been placed outside the demarcation and coded as conspiracy, pseudoscience, or delusion, which means the intensity of the ridicule directed at any given idea is itself directional evidence. It is a signal. The more aggressively the system works to suppress, mock, and marginalize a line of inquiry, the closer that inquiry is getting to something the system cannot afford to have decoded. The suppression is the map. The ridicule is the compass. Follow the intensity of the attack, and you will find the truth being protected by it. The demarcation is also maintained internally. It is maintained through the code that has been installed in the target's own mind. The most effective fence is not an external barrier. It is the self-censorship, the internalized doubt, the reflexive dismissal of certain ideas that the target performs on himself before any external enforcement is even needed. This is the ultimate function of long-term psychological conditioning. The target becomes his own gatekeeper. He polices his own thinking along the lines the system established. Decoding the demarcation means recognizing that the fence exists, identifying where it was placed and by whom, and deliberately stepping outside of it. Not recklessly, but methodically, with the analytical tools we have been building. The system is not as complex as it appears, and this needs to be said directly and repeatedly, because the illusion of complexity is itself one of the primary mechanisms of control. The average person looks at it and concludes, "This is too big, too intricate, too embedded to ever be fundamentally changed." And that conclusion, or that specific output, is exactly what the system was designed to produce. But no matter how many layers of surface detail you stack, the foundation underneath remains the same 7 principles operating in distorted form. The hermetic base code does not change. The operating system does not change. The binary logic does not change. Every layer of apparent complexity is downstream from that simple foundation. As we have stated, common sense is all that is needed to decode it, not a law degree, not a PhD, not access to classified information. The tools required are mental grounding, pattern recognition, binary decoding, and the willingness to trace effects back to their causes without stopping at the first convenient explanation. These are tools available to any mind that has not been successfully programmed to believe it lacks them. The complexity is not evidence of depth, it is evidence of concealment. And concealment is the behavior of a system that knows it cannot survive full exposure. Next, we have adaptive. When a population begins to decode one mechanism of control, the system shifts. The medium changes, the language changes, the visible form changes. What does not change is the foundation. This is why we must always look at the base logic underneath the adaptive surface, as the adaptation is designed to constantly shift and reset your decoding clock to make the familiar mechanism appear new and therefore unrecognized. Then we have the aspect of the system which is dynamic and regenerative. It does not collapse when one component is removed. It rebuilds, it restores, it reroutes. This regenerative capacity is sustained by the foundational constants the system is drawing from, and it will continue until the foundational inputs are addressed. Surface victories must be understood as tactical, not strategic, unless they are accompanied by foundational work at the level of the operating system. The system is also transfigurative. It changes form while retaining function. Slavery transfigures into mass incarceration. Colonial extraction transfigures into international debt structures. Overt propaganda transfigures into algorithmic curation. Chemical mind control transfigures into pharmaceutical mass sedation. The transfiguration is designed to reset moral opposition because opposition is organized around the visible form, and when the form changes, the opposition must reorganize while the function continues uninterrupted. Then we have atrophy, which means the system is atrophic in specific places. This matters because atrophy marks where the system is weakest, where the base logic is being most successfully countered. It is where the regenerative function is failing. The places the system attacks most desperately are often the places it is most atrophied. Concentrated, sustained pressure at the points of atrophy is where dismantling becomes possible. Output determines input. The results the system produces loop back and shape the conditions for the next cycle of inputs. A population conditioned into economic precarity produces the social conditions that justify further extraction. A population conditioned into psychological fragmentation produces the behavioral outputs that justify further surveillance and control. The cycle feeds itself, which means breaking the cycle requires interrupting the feedback at the point where output becomes input. That point is always the mind. The conditioned output of a programmed mind becomes the input that sustains the next cycle of programming. Correct the mind, and the output changes. Change the output, and the input for the next cycle changes. The feedback loop begins to work in reverse. Repetition of frequency waves is how the system maintains its installation. The same narratives repeat across every medium. The same psychological loops are reinforced continuously. The same binary assignments are restated in new language across generations. Repetition is not redundancy, it is maintenance. It is the system running its own update cycle to prevent the installed code from degrading, which means sustained counter-repetition, the deliberate, consistent, rhythmic introduction of true data, is the corresponding mechanism of correction. Finally, concreteness is the key that is most often overlooked. The system expresses itself in tangible, observable, documentable, measurable form, in legislation, in economic data, in biological outcomes, in media content, in architectural symbolism, in declassified documents. The evidence is always present. The system is not invisible. It has always been concrete. The question has never been whether the evidence exists. It has always been whether the observer was given the framework to recognize what they were looking at. In conclusion, we must understand that the system is not invincible. It is not eternal. It is not even original. It is a sophisticated imitation of constants it did not create, running on a borrowed foundation, sustained by the programmed confusion of the people it was built to suppress, defended by a demarcation it drew around its own secrets, and concealed behind a superficial complexity that dissolves the moment you apply the simple base logic underneath it. This is the key to all suffering in this enemy's world of mental confusion. Mental health and financial freedom are not separate problems with separate solutions. They are two outputs of the same corrupted operating system, which means correcting the OS corrects both simultaneously, because a mind that has decoded the binary assignments around its own worth, capability, and possibility will naturally begin making economic decisions from a foundation of clarity rather than programmed limitation. The enemy understands that psychological fragmentation is the most efficient form of economic control. A traumatized, depressed, confused, and self-doubting mind is not a mind that builds generational wealth, studies the architecture of financial systems, or directs its energy toward collective economic sovereignty. This is precisely why the mechanisms of soft mind control are concentrated most heavily in the communities the system most needs to keep economically dependent. Every concept and aspect of systems applies directly to financial literacy because the financial system runs on the same hermetic base code as every other warfare system, and the person who can decode superficial complexity, trace effects back to causes, and identify what is a constant versus what is interchangeable in an economic structure, is the person who can navigate it strategically rather than being consumed by it. True financial freedom, like true mental health, begins at the level of the operating system. It is not achieved by chasing interchangeable surface opportunities within a system whose binary code is still running in your mind unchallenged, but by correcting the foundational data, rewriting the assignments around value, ownership, and collective power, and building from constants rather than from the programmed limitations the system installed to keep you dependent. In other videos, as well as in our podcast, we have talked about melanin and viridic power. We have talked about trick magic and tricknology. We have talked about MK Ultra, hypnotic induction, frequency, and language, binary code, the hermetic laws as the operating system of reality, the psychology of the enemy, and how his secret language becomes readable once you understand his motive. This has now been simplified by bringing all of it together into a single unified framework for understanding not just what the system is, but how to take it apart and build one for ourselves. We now have the base logic. We now have the tools. We now have the root framework. The only question is whether we will apply it consistently, systematically, and at the level of the operating system rather than the surface. Decode the system, correct the mind, change the output.